Good afternoon. On behalf of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Perchloroethlyne, Breast Cancer and Prevention. My name is Michelle Dixon, and I am the Program and Development Coordinator for the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition, and I'm pleased that you could join us for this important topic. I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Richard Clapp. Dr. Clapp was the founding director of the Massachusetts Cancer Registry in the Department of Public Health from 1980 to 89. He joined the Boston University School of Public Health as a full-time faculty member in the Department of Environmental Health in 1993. He retired in 2010 and is now Professor Emeritus. He is also on the adjunct faculty at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Dr. Clapp has done research and taught courses in epidemiology and environmental health for over 30 years. His research interests include the health effects of environmental exposures to radiation and toxic chemicals. He is a member of several professional organizations and served on the editorial board of 2 journals. He also served on the Camp Lejeune Community Assistance Panel from 2006 to 2016. Welcome, Dr. Clapp.
Thank you, Michelle. As Michelle said, I've been looking at the toxic effects, especially the cancer effects of chemicals and radiation that people have been exposed to either at work or in their communities for over 30 years. The reason that there was a state cancer registry established in 1980 by the state legislature was because of water contamination in the town of Woburn, Massachusetts. I'm sure most of you have heard of the childhood leukemia cluster that happened in Woburn. This was, I guess you'd say, made famous perhaps by a book called A Civil Action and a movie by the same name. And one of the solvents that was in the drinking water in Woburn was perchloroethylene, also known as tetrachloroethylene, or sometimes just the 3 letters PCE. So perchloroethylene was used in a dry cleaning facility in Woburn, Massachusetts called UniFirst, and it was one of the contaminants that made it to the wells that were in East Woburn where the childhood leukemia cluster was identified. So it goes back, at least in Massachusetts, at least as far as the 1970s and early 1980s as a toxic chemical of concern. And in that instance, it was from a dry cleaning facility. It was an industrial dry cleaning facility called UniFirst, and they would clean uniforms from companies that had contracts with them. And the excess cleaning solvent, perchloroethylene, was either spilled or illegally dumped on the ground and made it into the groundwater and then seeped through the groundwater to the wells that were the contributors to the childhood leukemia finding over a decade later. So it's a solvent that's widely used in dry cleaning. It's also been used historically in manufacturing, for example, of textiles, and in printing. It's a solvent that can remove ink and other greases in printing, and it can remove grease from metal parts, as can another chemical that's called trichloroethylene. The 2 are closely related. They both have 2 carbons joined by a double bond, and then chlorines attached to the carbons. So if there are 4 chlorines to the 2 carbons, it's called tetrachloroethylene. If there are 3, it's called trichloroethylene, and they both have very similar properties. They're both used, for example, to remove grease from metal parts. And it used to be that both PCE, perc, and TCE were used in dry cleaning. Now I think it's almost entirely perchloroethylene or tetrachloroethylene that's used as a dry cleaning solvent. So, and there are other uses of perc in industry and in many parts of this country. But for this presentation, I think we're going to mostly focus on dry cleaning. Because it's used in so many small operations and some large ones, it's a very frequent pollutant that is found in Superfund sites around the U.S. I'm sure you all are familiar with the term Superfund. It's toxic contamination sites that are severe enough that they cause threats to the health of lots of people. That's how a facility or a community toxic exposure can be called a Superfund site. as if it's not only a toxic chemical, but it affects lots of people. So it is found, perchloroethylene is found in groundwater and around Superfund sites all across the United States. There was a unique use of perchloroethylene, not entirely in Massachusetts, but much of the use of this, or this unique operation, was found in Massachusetts, and that's when it was used to make a vinyl lining of asbestos cement water pipes. Believe it or not, asbestos cement has been used to convey water to people's homes in this country for years. It almost on the face of it sounds like a mistake to use a known carcinogen like asbestos in manufacturing cement pipes and then using them to deliver water to people's homes. And because of concerns about that, the fact that asbestos might be getting into people through their drinking water, the company that made these pipes figured a way of making a plastic lining, a vinyl lining. And in order to make the vinyl liquid such that it can be adhered to the inside of pipes, it was dissolved with perchloroethylene. So when the dissolved lining was placed inside the pipes, it was assumed that the perchloroethylene would just would dry and it would volatilize off into the air. So then the pipes were shipped to the parts of mostly Massachusetts, other New England states, where it was to be used. And it turned out later that all of the perchloroethylene did not evaporate and did not become volatile. It stayed in the vinyl lining such that when those pipes were actually used and connected to people's homes, a certain amount of perchloroethylene was leaching off the pipes, off the vinyl lining of the pipes, and showing up in people's drinking water. So that was another use of perchloroethylene that was not widespread, but it certainly formed the basis for concern, and then a whole series of health studies, which we'll talk about in a minute, that happened on Cape Cod. And the installation of the pipes was in the 1960s, and then the use of the discovery of perchloroethylene in the drinking water and the subsequent health studies happened 10 or 15 years later. Now going to go to the next slide. And these are some of the epidemiology studies. I hope you all can see this. These are screenshots on my computer as I'm talking to you. So the epidemiology studies that I mentioned about Cape Cod began, actually the initial approval was in the late 1980s. I was still the director of the State Cancer Registry when the decision to fund a series of studies on the Upper Cape Cod region was made by the state legislature, actually, and money was appropriated to set up a competitive bid process for most of the universities to propose ways of doing a series of studies for an unusual pattern of cancer that we saw in the Upper Cape Cod towns. Initially it was the 5 towns around Bourne, Sandwich, Mashpee, Falmouth, and Barnstable. That was the initial location of the Upper Cape Cod cancer studies, and one of those focused on this problem of PCE being in people's drinking water. And this is making a long story short, but there was a long period of collecting information. These are what were called case control studies, where cases of cancer, including breast cancer, were identified for the researchers by the State Cancer Registry. And then controls, who are people from the same 5 towns but who did not have cancer, were also included in the study. So there were patients who had a series of cancers, including breast cancer, and then a series of people who were controls, who were similar in many ways to the people who were cases of cancer but who did not have cancer. And then these folks were interviewed, telephone interviews primarily, and if the patient had died, then it was next of kin who was interviewed by telephone. And then if the control, who was essentially matched to those cases, if the patient had died, then the controls were people, the relatives of people who had died who also lived on Cape Cod but didn't have that same cancer. So it was a complicated and, I would say difficult study design, but it was carried out over a period of time in the early 1990s. And then one of the findings that was reported initially was that there was a small to moderate increase in the risk of breast cancer in those who had high levels of perchloroethylene in their drinking water. So this was, I would say, one of the very first studies of a fairly significant number of patients to link PCE to breast cancer, and this is all in women. And this was published by Dr. Ann Ashengrau and Dr. David Ozanoff and several of their colleagues at Boston University School of Public Health. Dr. Ashengrau is an epidemiologist, still works at Boston University, and has done a whole series of studies since these initial ones. But this was an important finding with regard to breast cancer and perchloroethylene. Subsequently, there have been many other studies of people exposed to perchloroethylene around the world. And so some of those have focused on, in fact, I'd say the largest number of any particular industry were in the dry cleaning industry because, as I said earlier, perc is now the most common dry cleaning solvent. And so studies of dry cleaning workers in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and even other parts of the world were included in a recent international review of what is the meaning of perchloroethylene as a potential carcinogenic exposure. And so those studies have now been reported. I would say the strongest signal that's come from the workers' studies has been with regard to bladder cancer. So in fact, I think the team of people that was established at the International Agency for Research on Cancer to review all these studies published a separate review article that said that there was the strongest evidence was that being exposed to perc at work increased the risk of bladder cancer. There have been other findings in other studies not as consistent as with bladder cancer. One of the things that epidemiologists do in order to come to a conclusion of what's the cause of some disease is they try to replicate it. They try to see whether it's found in different populations, with studies conducted by different researchers and see if there's a consistent pattern of an increase of some type of cancer in people who are exposed to the chemical or the exposure that you're interested in. And so the bladder cancer finding is the most consistent. Other studies, though, have identified increased cancer of the esophagus. Some also have, in addition to Dr. Ashengrau's study, found increased risk of breast cancer. Others have found non-Hodgkin's lymphoma to be increased in those exposed to perc, and then a few other types of cancer, for example, liver cancer and kidney cancer have shown up in other studies of workers, but again, not as consistently as bladder cancer has shown up to be increased with exposure to perc. Michelle has mentioned in the introduction that I've been a part of the Camp Lejeune Community Assistance Panel. This is it's a group of people who have an interest in cancer in those people who used to be stationed in the Marine base in North Carolina called Camp Lejeune, or family members of people who were based at the Marine base. The Community Assistance Panel is made up of independent scientists like myself. There have been a whole series of other scientists who, over the last 10 years or more, have participated. And then former Marines and former Marine family members. So it's been a fascinating process, actually, to watch the Community Assistance Panel get information about the ongoing studies of this Superfund site, Camp Lejeune, where they had water contamination, drinking water contamination with trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. In Camp Lejeune, the most pronounced exposure to perchloroethylene was in the family members of Marines who were based there, the so-called family housing area, where literally across the street was a dry cleaner that had used perchloroethylene for years and not properly disposed of it, or either leaked or spilled or dumped it onto the ground, and it made it into the sandy groundwater or the sandy soil underneath the dry cleaning facility, and then under the street, literally, to the wells that serve the family housing section of Camp Lejeune. So there were some fairly significant exposures to perc there, and it was especially to family members. There was also a dry cleaner on Camp Lejeune that cleaned the Marines' uniforms. So there was, again, leakage or spillage from the dry cleaning facility on the base for the Marine the Marines themselves, and that got into the groundwater, and then as a result was mixed with other sources of water from the Cape that served the entire base, or most of the base actually, 2 different water systems. So it was an issue there as well, not as much as trichloroethylene, which is actually the highest exposure I think ever been seen in a residential area. The trichloroethylene levels in the drinking water in Camp Lejeune were in the over 1,000 parts per million, which is, over 1,000 parts per billion, which is way, way higher than would be seen in a community in Upper Cape Cod or Woburn or other places where it's been studied. So in any case, perchloroethylene was one of the issues in Camp Lejeune, which I had direct experience with over the last 10 years. Now switching to a little more about the epidemiology. I hope you can see it. The first bullet on this page is about the International Agency for Research on Cancer. This is the international body. It's connected to the World Health Organization that sets up panels to review the evidence of what causes cancer. And in order to do the review, they look at studies of experimental animals, laboratory animals like rats and mice, who have been dosed with perchloroethylene either in the water that they're drinking or sometimes in the air, and then watches what happens to the animals. They also, these panels review the human studies, some of which I mentioned to you, and then they look at basic mechanistic data. How does the chemical seem to operate such a way that it may cause cancer? So these panels have a combination of epidemiologists, toxicologists, basic scientists, and they periodically review chemicals such as perchloroethylene, sometimes in combination with other similar solvents. And in the year 2014, they issued the most recent summary of the evidence that perchloroethylene caused cancer in humans, and they called it a probable human carcinogen. Their scheme is Group 1 is a known human carcinogen, Group 2A is probably human carcinogen, Group 2B is possibly a human carcinogen. So PERC had been Group 2B for the previous several years, decade actually or more, but in 2014 they moved it up to probable human carcinogen. It actually makes a big difference in terms of how strictly something gets regulated. If it gets to Group 1, then it's known to cause cancer in humans, and it shouldn't be in anyone's drinking water. When it's still called a probable carcinogen, there are what are called maximum contaminant levels, and that's the case with perchloroethylene. The summary of the evidence is called sufficient in experimental animals. In other words, PERC does cause cancer in lab animals such as rats and mice, especially liver cancer. And then in humans, the panel said there was limited evidence. In other words, some studies show that there was a strong association between perchloroethylene and human cancer, and some did not. But they called it limited as a summary. And those two combined is why it's called a probable human carcinogen. If the human evidence was considered definitive or sufficient, then with both categories calling it sufficient evidence, it would have been moved to Group 1. My prediction is it will eventually get there, but right now there haven't been enough studies in humans to give a consistent signal to these international panels. The US EPA calls perchloroethylene likely to be carcinogenic to humans, and a related US organization called the National Toxicology Program says that perchloroethylene is reasonably anticipated to be a carcinogen. So again, we're getting there, but the evidence isn't as strong as it is for some other chemicals. So what do we do about this? There are some solutions that are already in place. So for example, for drinking water, I mentioned that there is a maximum contaminant level that the EPA sets for perchloroethylene in the drinking water, and it's 5 parts per billion. This is a regulatory standard, and it's done after, it used to be much higher than that, and it was higher than that when Woburn's perchloroethylene water contamination was first identified, but it's been set at 5 parts per billion as a maximum contaminant level that should be allowed in anyone's drinking water. OSHA has regulations that allow 100 parts per million in air, over an 8-hour working day. And air is different. The dose is, more easily dispersed in air than it is in drinking water. Drinking water, of course, goes to everybody. It goes to infants. It goes to children who are still in utero because their mothers drank the water. It goes to people who have illnesses in the general population. So the levels in general, EPA levels are generally much lower than workplace levels. And in this case, the workplace levels have to do with air exposure, since that's the predominant way that people would be exposed during work hours. And then there are some cities and states that are requiring phase out of PCE in dry cleaning. In California, for example, California banned new dry cleaning machines from being put in place that used PERC in 2007, and it's supposed to be phased out. Perchloroethylene is supposed to be phased out of all dry cleaning machines in California by the year 2023. New York City hasn't banned or phased out perchloroethylene, but they have a regulation, a city regulation, that requires dry cleaners in New York City to post what chemicals they use. So it's a sort of consumer information type of regulation that at least people should know if they bring their clothes to a dry cleaner how it's going to be cleaned, whether it will be using chemicals, perchloroethylene or any other kind of chemical, or whether it can be some other method, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, and there are similar, there is conversation in Massachusetts, and there are phase outs already of dry cleaning facilities using PERC in Massachusetts, but the law that requires it is stronger actually in California, where there have been some proposed strengthened laws in Massachusetts, but they haven't made it through the state legislature yet. So now, what is happening in Massachusetts? As I said, there are some dry cleaning facilities that are already phasing out perchloroethylene in Massachusetts, and especially those that are co-located in the same building where the people are living, or child care facilities are located. So if there are co-location dry cleaners with either residences over the ground floor, for example, apartment buildings that are over a dry cleaning facility, or if there are child care facilities in the same building or nearby, PERC is being phased out as a dry cleaning chemical used in such facilities. The Toxics Use Reduction Institute, which is based at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, but is actually a separately funded, state-funded, but separately operating institute, has supported a transition to wet cleaning in Massachusetts. And wet cleaning is what it sounds like. It's using soap and detergent and water as the method of cleaning, and in some installations steam, soap and steam, and then a way of stretching the fabric so that when it dries it doesn't shrink. That has been implemented as something called wet cleaning in over 20 cleaners around Massachusetts. So this is a way out. It's a way out of the use of perchloroethylene as a dry cleaning solvent, because you can get the same result with just water and soap, or steam and soap. So that's happened in 20 different wet cleaners currently in Massachusetts, with strong support from the Toxics Use Reduction Institute. The Four Seasons Hotel in Boston, you may all have noticed on the Boston Common, this rather large hotel has done all of its in-house dry cleaning with wet cleaning. They've switched from using PERC to using a wet cleaning process at the Four Seasons Hotel. And presumably other facilities of that type and of that size will continue in that process as well. The staff person at the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, I think may be on this call, Joy Onash, stays in touch with the wet cleaners. She's been a constant source of support and expertise, and she told me that those wet cleaners who have reported that they have noticed an improvement in the work environment for their workers, fewer skin issues like rashes. I used to go to a dry cleaner who used solvents, and he had a machine right in his shop, and his skin was always cracked, and it was as if he had chapped hands year round, and so that type of thing has diminished in places that have switched to wet cleaning. And then the people who have done this transition report that it seems safer for pregnant women, and that includes the people who work in the cleaner and the people who come to pick up, the customers who come to pick up their clothes. So it's a positive health step to switch from perchloroethylene to wet cleaning or some equivalent steam-based method, and it's already been noticed by those who've done it in Massachusetts. Just say a little bit more about wet cleaning in a particular facility in Jamaica Plain, part of Boston called Jamaica Plain. About two and a half years ago, a collaborative group of people who live in Jamaica Plain and work there called the JP New Economy Transition, and then the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production. That's actually where I work at the UMass Lowell up in Lowell, but I do it from my home in Jamaica Plain. And then the Toxics Action Center, which is based in Boston, and TURI, the Toxic Use Reduction Institute. That was the four-part collaboration that led to the first wet cleaner in this area of Boston, at least, who had actually had a traditional dry cleaning facility using perchloroethylene, but wanted to move to the Jackson Square area of Jamaica Plain. And so they found out, and the JP New Economy Transition staff found out that they were interested in switching to wet cleaning. They got a grant to do this, to help with the purchase of the equipment in order to open a new shop in the Jamaica Plain neighborhood, Jackson Square. And the collaborative did what we call crowdfunding. I'm sure you've all heard of crowdfunding, trying to get people from the neighborhood to pledge either to do their cleaning there or actually just straight up make a donation to help the cost of setting up the new wet cleaning shop in Jackson Square. The family that did this is the Vargas family, Myra and her husband. They actually attended a wet cleaning demonstration in Walpole, a cleaner in Walpole that shows people how to do it. And they were convinced this is what they wanted to do, mainly for health reasons, for the health of themselves and their customers. And they opened up in September of 2014. And as I say, there was a ribbon cutting, and it was attended by city councilors and then the various members of the collaboration that supported it. And it's been in operation ever since. There may be an article that was posted along with this the PowerPoint for this webinar that was from the Boston Globe in October of 2014. The title of the article was in the Boston Globe magazine, the Sunday Globe magazine. The title was, "Can Jamaica Plain Businesses Go Carcinogen Free?" And with this as the example of a dry cleaning facility that had been established in Jamaica Plain without the use of a chemical perchloroethylene that is a probable human carcinogen. So I guess the answer to that is, at least in that instance, yes, it is possible to go carcinogen-free by setting up a wet cleaning facility in a place within Jamaica Plain. So here's my takeaway. I'd like to have a chance to have a discussion about this, so I'll leave plenty of time for us to have that conversation. But here are my conclusions so far, which is that PCE is a probable cause of cancer in humans. There is, continuing research about humans exposed to PCE. So my prediction is that at some point in the future it will be called a known human carcinogen, but at this stage it's called probably carcinogenic to humans. And there is some evidence that PCE causes breast cancer. And again, that is, I think, the strongest evidence for that comes from Dr. Ashengrau and Dr. Ozanoff and colleagues' studies of the perchloroethylene in drinking water in Cape Cod, which is still ongoing, actually. So although the pipes have been leached of their perchloroethylene and the levels are much lower now, the lingering effects are still possible to observe in people who've lived and grown up there. Exposure to PCE can be reduced or even eliminated in workplaces. For example, in dry cleaners, where you literally eliminate perc from the process, and it can be reduced when OSHA standards are actually enforced and either there are ways to reduce the exposures to workers in the workplace air, or there are substitutes that can be used to get the same process, whatever it is, the same result from whatever the process is with something that doesn't cause cancer, and certainly without perchloroethylene. And then similarly in consumer products, dry cleaning itself, for example, when you take your dry cleaning home and it's been dry cleaned, you bring a little perc back. If it's been dry cleaned with perchloroethylene, you bring a little of that into your home. So, and it does evaporate off dry cleaned clothing in your home into the indoor air. So that can be reduced or eliminated if you get your clothes cleaned in a process that doesn't use perc, like wet cleaning. And I guess I've already said this several times, that wet cleaning is a suitable alternative to using perc. It actually saves some money and it costs more in the machinery. So it's kind of a wash as to whether it's more expensive. It is slightly more expensive in the experience so far, but in any case, it's suitable and it's an alternative and it's worth the expense. In my view, that's where I get my clothes cleaned now, is at the Jamaica Plain wet cleaner. And then this can be done elsewhere. This wet cleaner and the 19 other wet cleaners can be magnified and multiplied in communities throughout Massachusetts. So it is possible that other communities, in fact some of you on this call may decide that you would like to make this happen in your community. So there's now a good track record. The people at the Toxic Use Reduction Institute give lots of good advice about this. There are demonstrations of how to do it for people who are thinking of making the switch in their dry cleaning shop, and that's all well in place and can be, the track record is proven, so that can be done in other communities as well. And sooner or later it will have to be done because as in California, eventually perc will be replaced as a way of cleaning clothes throughout this country. I think it is actually now being replaced in other countries for the obvious reason that there is the potential, pretty strong potential for causing cancer in those who are exposed to the chemicals. So why do it if there's an alternative available? So that's my story about this combination of perchloroethylene as a chemical that causes cancer, the evidence that it even causes breast cancer, as the people on this call I'm sure are primarily interested in, and then what can be done as an alternative and the solutions that are available for anybody in their community. I put some references on the last page of this. The first reference is by Dr. Ashengrau and some of her colleagues, including Dr. Ozanoff at Boston University. This is one of the additional studies of risk of breast cancer that was updated in 2003. The second reference is one that I think I mentioned was done by people who worked at the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and they focused particularly on tetrachloroethylene, they call it here, PERC, and bladder cancer risk, and they conclude that it is a bladder cancer risk in this article. The third bullet is an International Agency for Research on Cancer big thick review. For those of you who are gluttons for punishment and want to read it, it's several hundred pages, and it includes trichloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, and some other chlorinated solvents, one of which is called dichloroethylene, that are all summarized in a 2014 review. These are free and online. Again, if you really want to delve into it and see what the animal studies look like and how they understood the mechanism by which these chemicals cause cancer, it's all in that monograph published in 2014. And then lastly is the Toxic Use Reduction Institute wet cleaning website for people who are interested in having this transition. So it's primarily oriented toward small businesses that want to find out how to do it and what it entails. I noticed that the word wet cleaning at the end of that first line is missing an N, so if you use that website, make sure you put the second N in after the second time the word cleaning is used. It should have two N's in cleaning. Sorry about that. But in any case, the Toxic Use Reduction Institute is a fantastic resource for individuals who are interested in using safer chemicals in a lot of operations, including dry cleaning. And so the main website, turi.org, will get you to a wealth of information. So I think I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions. And if Michelle is back and her dog is taken care of.
I am back. Thank you, Dr. Clapp, very much. Sorry about that extra noise in the background. I would invite anyone who has a question to please feel free to type it in, and I'll be sure that Dr. Clapp can have a chance to review it. I'll start by asking, I am curious as I think about my own town, how to move our dry cleaners to this wet cleaning method. And would love to hear your thoughts on, do you start by business to business? Do you start at the town board level? How would you advise someone to take the first step?
Well, I can tell you how we did it in Jamaica Plain, and this might be a model for other communities. And that is literally going facility to facility. It was a fellow named Carlos that went and knocked on, well, he didn't walk on, he went into dry cleaning facilities up and down the main streets in Jamaica Plain and talked to people, asked them, are you interested? There is this mechanism for transitioning. Are you interested in finding out more about it? And when he found the Vargas family that was operating a facility, actually I think in Roslindale, the adjacent neighborhood in Boston, that were interested, then he put them in touch with the folks at Turi, with Joy Onash in particular, and then from there they found out more about how it would work, what the machinery that was required would be, and how to pay for it, including with a Turi grant and the additional effort that we all, the collaboration of us, managed to get underway for crowdfunding. They visited a demonstration project, and again, Joy can, these are being held periodically around the state, not always in Walpole actually, but in other facilities. So the family that was interested in doing this transition went and visited and saw the demonstration, and the conversation was underway. Took probably another 6 months before they could get the new facility in place, the machinery in place, and open up. But it was started with a door-to-door canvassing of dry cleaning facilities in this neighborhood area of Jamaica Plain. In other towns, it may be, in a smaller town actually, it may be that the town council is the way to go. And it can be raised by citizens at a town council meeting. Can we pass an ordinance? It could even start as an ordinance like the New York City one. That's online, it's available, and it's essentially a labeling ordinance that says that any facility in our town that's going to use chemicals in dry cleaning has to post what they're using, has to put a, excuse me, a sheet on the window. I've been talking too much. And so the first step could be to a town council.
Okay, thank you. And the resources that you've provided today will be up on the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition's website so that people have a place to go to reference the information that you've provided. So I appreciate that.
Good. You know, let me...
Do we have... I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Now that I got my voice back, Michelle, let me add one more thing. Oh, there was a piece of legislation drafted in the State House, the Massachusetts House of Representatives, that would have sped up this process and would have required timelines, for example, for transitioning away from perchloroethylene to wet cleaning. That hasn't passed. But if there is a state representative from your town, the person who originally drafted this legislation was a state representative from Brookline. His name is Smizek, Representative S-M-I-Z-E-K, I believe it is, or S-M-I-Z-I-K, one of the two. It might be possible for an interested state representative to begin that process again. It would have to be started probably next fall or next December to be discussed in next year's legislative session. But that would actually, if there were a state law that was passed and it set timelines, that would push every community in the state to move to this transition. So I guess it depends on, in an individual person's case, or in your case, Michelle, what you think is possible at your town council, and if not, then if there's a state representative that might be interested in talking to Representative Smizik to resurrect the piece of legislation that he came up with, or alternatively, if neither of those is of interest, then talking to your dry cleaner and seeing directly if they're interested in a transition, and then putting them in touch with Tori.
Okay, wonderful. And you actually answered a question that just came in as to what to do at the state level.
Yeah, I mean, as in California, if you pass a state law requiring a transition by, say, the year 2023, it puts everyone on notice that they better start the process, because at some point they're going to have to. And you know, you could say it gives them 5 years or more actually to figure out how and when they're going to do it. But state laws are the most authoritative way of going about it, if you can get it passed. No easy trick sometimes.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to leave it open for a second or two to see if we have any more questions. Well, Dr. Klopp, I have to say thank you. You've given us a lot to think about today, and some great information as well as some great resources, which as I said, will be up on NBCC's website. I appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us today.
My pleasure.
And so
always glad to do it.
So I will say on behalf of Cheryl Osimo, our Executive Director, and our Board of Directors, I want to thank all of you for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us today. And please visit our website for more information. And I wish you all a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.